The War of Scottish Independence has been raging for 18 years, and in that time many men and women have taken their place in history, with some fighting for their family's fortune, or for some fighting for their rightful king to regain his throne. But after many years of back and forth fighting, and even a civil war, the Scots are starting to become unified under King Robert Bruce, as his string of victories at Glentoul, Loudon Hill and the Pass of Brander have enabled him to consolidate his power in Scotland, and with a successful series of hit-and-run raids on any English encroachment that would try to wrestle back the land King Robert had regained, particularly in the north of Scotland, as that would be nearly impossible, as King Robert's men were now experts in guerrilla war tactics. For years since the start of the war, the Scots have been played against each other by the English King Edward I, also known as the Hammer of the Scots, as Edward had used all manner of litigations, titles and lands to those that were loyal to him in order to secure Scotland and title himself as Lord of Scotland. Yet after the Scots allied themselves to the French in 1296, King Edward invaded Scotland in the same year and defeated the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar, which subjugated most of the Scottish nobility. The fight was then taken up by two minor nobles, Andrew Moray and William Wallace, who fought to place John Balliol back on the throne of Scotland. Stirling Bridge was the first major battle after Dunbar, which the Scots won, but Andrew Moray died from wounds sustained from the battle. William Wallace would carry on the fight even after his defeat at Falkirk, before being captured and executed after a mock trial in 1305. And with the fall of Stirling Castle in 1304, Scotland was subjugated briefly once again. But by 1306, Robert the Bruce had crowned himself as King of Scotland, and was rallying the Scots to fight again. But after a setback at the Battle of Methin, King Robert began using hit-and-run tactics, as facing the English in an open battlefield with limited numbers would be the quickest way to lose the war, unless the battlefield was designed in the Scots' favour. But the biggest factor in tipping the scales in the Scots' favour would be the death of King Edward and his successor, King Edward II's poor leadership. By 1309 there was a lull in the fighting, and King Robert took the time to win over any Scottish lords that were loyal to the English. The Earl of Ross would be the first noble to join in 1308, despite the fact that he was the earl that had surrendered King Robert's wife to the English in 1306. More Scottish nobles would join King Robert. James Stewart and Thomas Randolph would be the most prominent figures to join. And at St Andrews, King Robert held a parliament, where the Scottish clergy and nobility made a declaration that John Balliol was not the rightful king and was instead an English pawn. This declaration was a bold move, as it told the world that Robert was the rightful king of Scotland and had always been the true heir after the death of Alexander III and his children. King Edward II, of course, refused to acknowledge this, and launched a campaign into Scotland in 1310. But once again, King Robert's troops would not engage the English in open battle, and would stick to hit-and-run tactics, where any English detachment would be attacked if they strayed too far from their garrisons. By the winter of 1310, King Edward retired to his winter quarters. The expedition gave Edward nothing but more financial woes. 1311 would see King Edward's royal authority reduced by his own noblemen, as they had formed a council and drafted ordinances. But despite Edward's objections, he found himself with few allies, as his closest friend, Piers Gaveston, was executed in 1312 by the Earl of Warwick. With England in disarray and close to a civil war, this gave King Robert more time and opportunities to retake the southern Scottish castles, as they were fortified significantly more than the northern castles that Robert captured in 1307. But first, Robert would launch several raids into England in 1311, which soon filled his coffers with loot and cattle. Robert hoped that these raids would apply pressure to King Edward and force his hand into signing a peace treaty. Robert then wrote to King Edward asking for peace from one king to another. While Robert was seeking peace with Edward, he was also besieging Dundee Castle, as the castle was a vital supply point, as supplies could be delivered by the sea, and the road through Dundee would also lead to the city of Perth. The castle was garrisoned by only 200 men, and supplies were already low, as the commander of the castle, William Montfichet, made a deal with Robert to exchange the castle in return for prisoners of war. When the news reached King Edward, he was furious and hastily wrote to Montfichet to break his agreement with Robert, as Edward would send supplies of 100 quarters of beans, peas, malt and wheat. But by the time the letter arrived, the castle was already in Robert's control, and Robert continued his policy of destroying castles, denying the English the opportunity to fortify and control the area. The city of Perth was Robert's next target. The commander of the city was none other than William Oliphant, the man who commanded the defence of Stirling Castle in 1304. Oliphant had sworn loyalty to the English in exchange for his freedom, and as it took the use of the trebuchet Warwolf to make Oliphant surrender Stirling Castle, Robert would find taking Perth a difficult task. Robert devised a plan to take the city. His forces would fall back for a few days until the garrison thought that Robert's army had moved on or fallen back to Dundee to resupply. Then, in the dead of night, Robert personally led his men, despite the danger, as one French knight in Robert's service would say. Robert was also the first to scale the walls, and before the night's watch could alert the rest of the garrison, the gates of the city were open and the main Scottish force poured in. Shortly after, Robert marched to finish the siege of Dumfries, which surrendered in February 1313, and by November, Robert held another parliament and declared that any Scot who did not make peace with Robert and accept him as King of Scotland would be disinherited from their lands and titles. King Edward responded by organising an army to march into Scotland, as Edward's issues in England were somewhat fixed, as he temporarily made a truce of his barons, and by the time Edward had gathered his forces, only Stirling Castle and Berwick remained in English control, as Edinburgh and Roxburgh had been recaptured. Roxburgh Castle was taken in a cunning tactic by James Douglas, as he captured the castle by disguising his forces as cattle under the night sky, and by slowly crawling towards the castle. And as the Night's Watch assumed they were cattle, James's men then managed to throw grappling hooks on the castle walls, then scale the walls before silencing the Night's Watch. The rest of the garrison was celebrating the Feast of Shroves Tuesday. The castle was dismantled after being captured. Stirling Castle was besieged by Robert's forces in the spring of 1314, and once the blockade was complete, the commander of the castle promised to surrender the castle if a relief force did not arrive by summer. The stage was set for the Battle of Bannockburn.
Me